The sound of glass shattering echoed through the dorm at 2:13 a.m., and when everyone rushed into the kitchen, they found Felix standing barefoot among broken pieces, trembling violently while one member stared at him with cold, unreadable eyes. Rain hammered against the windows like impatient fists, turning the entire dorm into a cage filled with shadows and silence. The fluorescent kitchen light flickered weakly above them, exposing Felix's pale face and the thin line of blood running across his ankle. His breathing was uneven, shallow, almost frightened. "Come closer," the cold voice said. Every head turned immediately toward Lee Know. The tension in the room changed instantly. Bang Chan frowned first, confusion hardening his expression. "What's wrong with you?" Lee Know crossed his arms slowly, leaning against the counter as if nothing unusual had happened. His eyes remained fixed on Felix, unreadable and sharp. "I said don't come closer." Lowered his gaze immediately. That was what shocked everyone the most. Normally, Felix would laugh awkwardly, wave his hands, or try to lighten the atmosphere. He hated conflict more than anyone. But now he simply stood there silently, shoulders tense, fingers trembling beside him, and he looked afraid, not of the broken glass, of Lee Know. The storm outside growled louder. Hyunjin stepped forward first, instinctively moving closer to Felix. "Hey, you're bleeding!" Flinched before Hyunjin even touched him. That tiny reaction made the room colder. Hyunjin froze mid-motion. Bang Chan's expression darkened immediately. "Felix!" "Fine," Felix whispered, too quickly, too rehearsed, too automatic. The kitchen smelled like rainwater, instant ramen, and something burnt from the toaster left plugged in earlier that night. Yet underneath all of it was another scent, the sharp metallic smell of anxiety hanging in the air. Han quietly picked up a towel and crouched near Felix, carefully wrapping it around his ankle. "You should sit down," nodded without speaking. Lee Know watched the entire scene in silence. That silence was worse than yelling, because everyone in the group knew Lee Know had always been difficult to read. He loved quietly, cared quietly, worried quietly. But something about tonight felt different. Detached. Cold. Like he had built an invisible wall around himself, and Felix knew exactly where that wall began, 3 months earlier. It had started during rehearsals. Nobody noticed it at first because Lee Know still practiced perfectly, still corrected choreography, still cooked late-night meals for everyone. But little things changed. He stopped sitting beside Felix during interviews. He avoided eye contact during live streams. Whenever Felix laughed too loudly, Lee Know's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Only Felix noticed all of it, because Felix always noticed everything about the people he loved, especially Lee Know. "Tell them what happened," Lee Know suddenly said. The words sliced through the room. Felix's face turned pale instantly. Bang Chan looked between them carefully. "What is he talking about?" Felix opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Rain crashed violently outside. Hyunjin stood up slowly now, his protective instincts becoming visible in the tension of his shoulders. "Why are you acting like this?" Lee Know laughed softly. It wasn't a warm laugh, it sounded exhausted. "Because none of you know him." The room went silent again. Felix's breathing became shakier. "I know enough," Hyunjin snapped. Lee Know replied calmly. "You know the version he wants you to see." Closed his eyes. That hurt more than shouting ever could, because it was partially true. Felix had spent years becoming sunlight for other people, smiling through exhaustion, laughing through homesickness, hiding panic attacks behind freckles and soft voices because he hated burdening anyone. But Lee Know had seen behind the performance, and once someone sees the real cracks in you, they can either love you deeper or walk away completely. Bang Chan rubbed his forehead tiredly. "Can someone explain what's happening?" Nobody answered immediately. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the background. Somewhere in the dorm, thunder rolled low and heavy. Then Felix finally spoke. "I ruined something important." His voice barely sounded human. Hyunjin looked confused. "What do you mean?" Felix swallowed hard. "I lied." Lee Know's expression hardened instantly. Han slowly stood up beside Felix now, sensing the emotional landmine hidden beneath every sentence. Felix stared at the floor while speaking. There was an offer from Australia 3 months ago, a solo project. His fingers curled tighter around the bloody towel. "I turned it down." Bang Chan blinked in surprise. "You never told us." Felix shook his head slowly. "I was going to," he whispered. But he thought all of you would hate him for leaving," Lee Know finished sharply. Felix looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Hyunjin frowned. "Nobody would hate him for that." "You don't understand," Lee Know muttered. And maybe he was right, because the real problem wasn't the offer. It was what happened after. Lee Know had accidentally discovered the email one night while helping Felix organize files on his laptop. At first, he thought Felix had simply forgotten to mention it, but when he confronted him privately, Felix broke down crying. Not because he wanted to leave, but because a part of him did. That confession destroyed something between them. Lee Know had spent years believing Felix stayed because he genuinely wanted to. But suddenly doubt poisoned every memory, every smile, every promise. Was Felix happy here or trapped? Lee Know never found the answer, and the uncertainty slowly turned into resentment. Not hatred, never hatred, something more painful, fear disguised as anger. Felix finally sat down weakly on the couch while everyone processed the truth in stunned silence. Bang Chan's eyes softened first. "You should have told us." "I know. Why didn't you?" Felix laughed bitterly under his breath. "Because I'm selfish." "No," Hyunjin said immediately. Felix looked at him. Hyunjin's expression had completely changed now, gentler, sadder. "You were scared." Those words nearly broke Felix apart, because they were true. The dorm became quiet except for rain hitting the windows endlessly. Lee Know finally pushed himself away from the counter. "You should clean your foot before it gets infected." His tone was emotionless again. Felix nodded faintly. But when Lee Know walked past him, Felix instinctively reached for his sleeve, just for a second, just enough to stop him. The entire room froze again. Felix's voice cracked quietly. "Do you still hate me?" Lee Know stopped moving. His back remained turned toward everyone. For a long moment, nobody breathed. Then Lee Know answered softly, almost too softly to hear. "If I hated you, this wouldn't hurt so much." Somehow that confession felt more devastating than anger, because love was still there, broken, bleeding. Buried under disappointment and fear, but still alive. Felix's eyes filled immediately. Hyunjin looked away first, uncomfortable witnessing something so painfully intimate. Bang Chan exhaled slowly like he finally understood the true shape of the conflict. Lee Know wasn't the one member who loved Felix less. He was the one who loved him so deeply that betrayal felt unbearable. And Felix was terrified that being loved conditionally was the same thing as being abandoned. The storm outside gradually softened into quieter rain. But inside the dorm, the damage remained, visible in trembling hands, in exhausted eyes, in words that arrived too late. Lee Know finally looked back over his shoulder. His expression was tired rather than cruel now. "You should sleep," Felix stared at him silently. Then he whispered the truth he had been hiding for months. "I stayed because this feels like home." Lee Know's composure cracked for the first time that night, just slightly. Tiny fracture in the armor. And in that small moment, everyone in the room realized something heartbreaking. Sometimes the people who hurt each other the most are the ones most afraid of losing each other forever. Morning arrived quietly, but the tension inside the dorm never disappeared. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the city wrapped in silver fog and cold silence. Weak sunlight slipped through the kitchen curtains, illuminating the shattered glass that nobody had cleaned completely the night before. Tiny fragments still glittered near the cabinets like forgotten memories. Felix hadn't slept at all. He sat alone on the balcony wrapped in an oversized hoodie, knees pulled against his chest while the chilly morning wind brushed through his blonde hair. The city below looked distant and blurry, swallowed by mist. Cars moved like ghosts between wet streets. Usually mornings were his favorite. Usually he loved the calm. But today his chest felt unbearably heavy. The sliding door opened softly behind him. Felix already knew who it was before hearing the footsteps. Bang Chan handed him a warm cup of coffee without speaking first. Steam rose between them in soft curls. "You're going to freeze out here," accepted the cup carefully. "Sorry." Chan leaned against the railing beside him. "You apologize too much." A faint smile almost appeared on Felix's lips but vanished quickly. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was tired. After several minutes, Chan finally spoke again. "Was it really that bad?" Felix stared down at the coffee. "What?" The offer. His fingers tightened around the cup. The memory returned immediately. The email, the excitement, the guilt. Australia had offered him a temporary solo opportunity. Music shows, interviews, collaborations, a chance to reconnect with parts of himself he missed desperately. His family had cried when hearing about it. His mother told him she was proud. His sisters begged him to come home even for a little while. And for one dangerous moment, Felix had wanted it more than anything. "I thought about leaving," Felix admitted quietly. Chan nodded once. "'Kay," blinked in surprise. "That's it." Chan looked at him carefully now. "Did you think I'd be angry?" Felix lowered his eyes again. I didn't know, Chan sighed softly. Felix, everyone thinks about leaving sometimes, the word stunned him. You too, Chan laughed weakly. Especially me. For the first time that morning, Felix looked genuinely shocked. Chan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Being responsible for people all the time gets heavy. The city wind carried distant traffic sounds between them. Felix suddenly realized something painful. He had spent so much time hiding his own fears that he forgot everyone else was struggling too, even Chan, especially Chan. You stayed, Felix whispered. Chan smiled faintly. So did you. Before Felix could answer, loud footsteps exploded inside the dorm, then shouting. Where is he? Felix froze instantly. Hyunjin, Chan closed his eyes briefly. And there goes the peaceful morning. The balcony door slammed open seconds later. Hyunjin stood there breathing heavily, dark hair messy from sleep, oversized sweater hanging off one shoulder. His eyes locked immediately onto Felix's bandaged ankle. You're outside with an injury, Felix blinked. It's not that serious. You were literally bleeding last night. Hyunjin crouched in front of him without permission, inspecting the bandage with frustrated concentration. His fingers were gentle despite the irritation on his face. You should rest properly. Stared at him quietly, Hyunjin always expressed affection through scolding, through hovering, through dramatic complaints that hid genuine concern underneath. It was strangely comforting. Chan smirked slightly. You sound like an angry mother. Someone has to, Hyunjin muttered. Felix almost laughed, almost. But then another presence entered the room behind them, and the warmth disappeared instantly. Lee Know had just woken up. His dark shirt hung loosely against his frame, hair slightly damp from washing his face. He looked exhausted. The moment his eyes met Felix's, the air changed again, not hostile, worse, careful, as if both of them were afraid of saying the wrong thing. Hyunjin noticed it immediately. His protective mood sharpened again. You should talk to him properly, Hyunjin said suddenly. Lee Know frowned slightly. About what? About whatever happened between you two. Chan quietly stepped backward. Smart leader, he knew an emotional disaster when he saw one. Lee Know crossed his arms. There's nothing to discuss. Looked down instantly, Hyunjin scoffed. You've been ignoring him for months. You've been involving yourself in things you don't understand. Atmosphere cracked again. Hyunjin stood up slowly now. What's that supposed to mean? Lee Know's expression remained unreadable. Exactly what it sounds like. Felt panic rising immediately. Stop, he whispered. Neither listened. Hyunjin stepped closer. You don't get to punish him forever because he was scared. Lee Know's jaw tightened visibly. You think this is punishment? Yes, no, Lee Know replied quietly. This is me trying not to fall apart. The anger in Hyunjin's face faded slightly. That answer was too honest, too raw. Lee Know laughed bitterly under his breath. You know what the worst part was? His eyes shifted toward Felix finally. Not the possibility of him leaving. Felix's breathing became shallow again. The worst part was realizing he thought we'd only love him if he stayed. Nobody spoke, because there was nothing to say. Felix felt tears burning behind his eyes instantly. He hated crying, especially in front of people, but his emotions had been stretched too thin for too long. I didn't want to disappoint anyone, he whispered. Lee Know looked exhausted rather than angry now. You could never disappoint us by being honest. Looked away immediately, because honesty was terrifying. Honesty meant admitting he sometimes missed Australia so badly it physically hurt. It meant admitting idle life exhausted him. It meant admitting he occasionally felt trapped between gratitude and suffocation. And he was terrified those feelings made him unlovable. Hyunjin slowly relaxed his shoulders, the fight draining out of him. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Lee Know quietly walked toward the kitchen. Everyone thought the conversation was over, until he stopped beside Felix's chair. Without looking directly at him, Lee Know placed a small plate on the table, French toast, slightly burnt at the edges, exactly how Felix liked it. Felix stared at the plate silently. Lee Know finally spoke without raising his eyes. You skipped dinner yesterday. Then he walked away again, just like that, no dramatic apology, no emotional speech, only breakfast. But somehow that tiny act hurt Felix more than shouting ever could, because after everything, Lee Know still remembered how he liked his food. And that meant he had never truly stopped caring at all.
The smell of burnt sugar and butter lingered in the kitchen long after Lee Know disappeared down the hallway. Felix stared silently at the plate in front of him, unable to move. The French toast was unevenly cut, slightly too dark on one side, dusted with too much powdered sugar. Perfect, because Lee Know only cooked like that when he was distracted. And Felix knew exactly what distracted him. Emotions. Hyunjin leaned against the counter, watching Felix carefully now. Earlier anger in his face had faded, replaced by concern. "You should eat before it gets cold." Nodded faintly but didn't touch the fork. Bang Chan quietly glanced between both of them before speaking. "We have rehearsal in 2 hours. Nobody answered immediately. Chan sighed. "And before either of you panic, yes, the atmosphere is going to be horrible." That almost earned a smile from Hyunjin. Almost. Felix finally picked up the fork with trembling fingers. The first bite nearly destroyed him. Because it tasted familiar, warm, safe, home, his throat tightened painfully. Lee Know remembered everything, not just how Felix liked his breakfast, but how he hated crust cut too neatly because it reminded him of hospitals. How he liked extra cinnamon when stressed. How he secretly preferred eating quietly in the mornings before schedules because loud noise overwhelmed him after sleepless nights. Nobody else noticed those things, only Lee Know. And somehow that made the distance between them hurt even more. The rehearsal studio later that afternoon felt colder than usual. Bright fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors while music thundered through massive speakers hard enough to shake the mirrors. Sweat, hairspray, and exhaustion filled the air. Normally rehearsals were chaotic in a comforting way. Today everyone felt tense, even the staff noticed. Felix stood near the back while stretching silently. His ankle still hurt slightly beneath the bandage, but he ignored it. Physical pain was easier to handle than emotional confusion. Across the room, Lee Know adjusted choreography notes with mechanical focus, avoiding eye contact again. Hyunjin noticed too, which was exactly why he became more clingy toward Felix than usual. Deliberately, every time rehearsal paused, Hyunjin handed Felix water first, sat beside him first, asked if his ankle hurt every 20 minutes. It wasn't subtle, and everyone knew why, especially Lee Know. The music stopped abruptly after another failed formation. Again from the second chorus, the choreographer called out tiredly. Groans echoed around the room. Felix wiped sweat from his forehead, breathing heavily now. His injured ankle throbbed sharply each time he pivoted during turns, but he kept dancing anyway. He always kept going, even when he was hurting. That was part of the problem. The music restarted. Bodies moved instantly into formation. One step, turn, slide, sharp movement, then pain exploded through Felix's ankle. A quiet gasp escaped him before he stumbled sideways violently. Everything stopped. "Felix!" Hyunjin reached him first, grabbing his arm before he hit the floor completely. The room erupted into concern immediately. "Sit down. Are you okay? You shouldn't have practiced yet." Winced, trying to stand properly again. "I'm fine, you're obviously not." The voice came from behind everyone. Lee Know. His tone wasn't loud, but it cut through the room instantly. Felix froze. Lee Know walked toward him with visible irritation now, though not the cruel kind. Worse, worried irritation. "You can barely put weight on your foot." Looked embarrassed under everyone's attention. "I didn't want to slow rehearsal down." Lee Know stared at him in disbelief. "Hurting yourself more is somehow helpful." Felix opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because he had no answer, Lee Know exhaled sharply and crouched in front of him before anyone could react. The entire room went silent, including the staff. Lee Know carefully reached for Felix's ankle, fingers surprisingly gentle despite the frustration written across his face. Felix inhaled sharply when those fingers brushed against sensitive skin. "You're swollen again," Lee Know muttered. His voice softened unconsciously while examining the injury. And everyone noticed. Hyunjin noticed most of all. Something unreadable flickered across his face briefly. Not jealousy, realization, because this wasn't hatred, not even close. This was someone trying desperately to stop caring and failing miserably. Felix looked down at Lee Know quietly, heart pounding painfully now. Up close he could see the exhaustion beneath Lee Know's eyes, the sleeplessness, the emotional strain hidden under cold expressions for months, and guilt crashed into Felix all over again. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Lee Know paused. For 1 second his hands tightened slightly around Felix's ankle, then he let go immediately and stood up. "Stop apologizing for existing." The room became painfully quiet. Felix stared at him. Lee Know looked away first, because maybe he regretted sounding that emotional in front of everyone. Chan cleared his throat awkwardly. "Okay, break time." Everyone scattered instantly. The tension was too personal now, too intimate. Felix slowly sat on the floor near the mirror while the others grabbed drinks and towels. His ankle pulsed painfully beneath the bandage. A bottle of cold water appeared beside him minutes later. "Lee Know again." Felix looked up carefully. "You need ice too," Lee Know said quietly. Felix hesitated before speaking. "Why are you still taking care of me?" Lee Know looked genuinely confused by the question, then sad. "Because I don't know how to stop." Honesty in that answer stole all the air from Felix's lungs. Around them, the rehearsal studio continued moving normally, staff talking, music restarting quietly, members joking in the background, but suddenly everything felt distant, muted, like the world narrowed into this one fragile conversation. Felix lowered his eyes slowly. "I thought you hated me." Lee Know laughed softly, tiredly. "If I hated you, this would have been easier." Felt his chest ache. Lee Know sat beside him now, keeping a careful distance between them. Not too close, not too far, the mirrors reflected both of them side by side under harsh white lights. "You know what scared me?" Lee Know asked quietly. Felix shook his head. Lee Know stared at the floor while speaking. "One day you'll realize you deserve a life that doesn't hurt this much." His voice almost cracked there. "And then you'll leave for real." Felix's eyes widened slightly, because underneath all the coldness. That was the truth. Lee Know wasn't angry Felix considered leaving. He was terrified Felix still might. Felix swallowed hard. "You really think I'd abandon everyone?" "No," Lee Know admitted softly. "I think you'd sacrifice yourself until you finally break." Those words hit too close, far too close, because Felix had been breaking quietly for months already, and Lee Know had noticed before anyone else. The rehearsal ended hours later. But exhaustion clung to everyone like a second skin. Night had already swallowed the city by the time the members returned to the dorm. Neon lights bled through the car windows while soft music played quietly from the radio, though nobody paid attention to it. The atmosphere inside the van remained unusually subdued. Felix sat near the back with his hood pulled low, resting his forehead against the cool glass. His ankle still hurt, but his chest hurt more. Because every word from Lee Know kept replaying endlessly in his mind. "I think you'd sacrifice yourself until you finally break." The terrifying part was how accurate it sounded. Felix had spent so many years becoming whatever people needed from him that sometimes he forgot who he actually was when nobody was watching. Sunshine, comfort, warmth, that was the version everyone loved, but lately maintaining that version felt exhausting, and Lee Know noticed. Of course he did. The dorm was quieter than usual after dinner. Some members disappeared into their rooms immediately while others stayed in the living room watching random videos half-heartedly. Felix escaped to the laundry room just for silence. The tiny space smelled like detergent and fabric softener, humming softly from the dryer spinning nearby. Warm air filled the cramped room, making it strangely comforting. He sat on the floor beside the washing machine, pulling his knees against his chest again. It was becoming a habit, one he didn't notice until now. Felix closed his eyes briefly. He remembered Australia again, summer air, ocean wind, his mother's cooking, the sound of English spoken casually around him instead of interviews and schedules and cameras. Home, a painful ache spread through his chest. You disappear whenever you're overwhelmed. Opened his eyes instantly. Lee Know stood quietly in the doorway. The harsh hallway light behind him cast shadows across his expression, but he didn't look angry tonight. Just tired. Felix looked away first. "I wasn't hiding." "You always hide in small rooms when you're upset." The statement was so specific it almost hurt. Lee Know noticed things nobody else did, tiny habits, micro-expressions, changes in breathing. Sometimes Felix wondered if Lee Know understood him better than he understood himself. The dryer continued spinning softly between them. Lee Know walked inside slowly before sitting across from him on the floor. The cramped room suddenly felt even smaller. For several moments neither spoke, then Lee Know quietly asked, "Do you still want to go back?" Felix's heart stopped, not because of the question, because of how carefully Lee Know asked it, like he was terrified of the answer. Felix stared at his hands. "Sometimes." Lee Know nodded once, no visible reaction, but Felix noticed his fingers tighten slightly against his sleeve. "That doesn't mean I want to leave everyone." "I know, do you?" Lee Know finally looked at him directly now. The softness in his eyes nearly shattered Felix completely. "You can miss home and still love us." Felt tears threaten again immediately. He hated how emotional he'd become lately. "I didn't know if anyone would understand." Lee Know laughed quietly under his breath. "Felix, half of us are surviving on anxiety and emotional repression." A weak laugh escaped Felix before he could stop it. The sound seemed to surprise both of them. For the first time in months, the tension between them eased slightly, only slightly, but enough. Lee Know leaned his head back against the wall behind him. "When I found that email," he paused carefully, "I kept thinking maybe you were happier before us." Blinked. "What?" You smiled differently when you talked about Australia. Felix's expression softened immediately. "That's because it's home." Lee Know nodded slowly. "I know." "No," Felix whispered. "I don't think you do." Lee Know looked at him quietly. Felix swallowed hard before continuing. "When I talk about Australia, I miss who I was before everything became so complicated." His voice weakened slightly. "But when I think about leaving here," he stopped. Because suddenly speaking felt dangerous, Lee Know waited patiently. The dryer beeped loudly in the silence. Felix finally whispered the truth anyway. It feels like losing part of myself. Something in Lee Know's expression broke apart at those words. Relief, pain, affection, all tangled together. You idiot, Lee Know murmured softly. Felix laughed weakly through watery eyes. That's rude. You scared me. Honesty in that confession filled the tiny laundry room completely. Lee Know rarely admitted fear. He disguised it as annoyance, criticism, distance. But underneath all of it, fear always existed quietly inside him. Fear of abandonment. Fear of loving people more than they loved him back. Fear of needing someone too much. And Felix suddenly realized something devastating. Lee Know had pulled away not because he cared less, but because he cared too much. Felix lowered his gaze slowly. I'm sorry I made you feel like I'd leave, Lee Know sighed softly. And I'm sorry I made you feel unloved for being confused. The room became silent again, warm, heavy, real. Felix wiped his eyes quickly, embarrassed. I've been crying a lot lately. That's because you keep everything inside until it explodes. That sounds psychologically concerning. It is, laughed again despite himself. This time Lee Know smiled too, small, brief, but real, and somehow that tiny smile felt more precious than sunlight. Then footsteps echoed suddenly from the hallway. The laundry room door swung open dramatically. Hyunjin froze immediately after seeing both of them sitting together on the floor. The silence that followed was painfully awkward. Hyunjin narrowed his eyes suspiciously. Why does this look emotional? Lee Know instantly stood up. It's not. That response alone makes it emotional. Quickly wiped his face again. Too late, Hyunjin noticed immediately. Oh my god. He pointed accusingly at Lee Know. Did you make him cry again? I didn't. You absolutely did. Laughed helplessly while Lee Know looked offended for the first time all day. I was literally apologizing. Hyunjin blinked dramatically. You apologized willingly. Are you sick? Lee Know looked ready to throw detergent at him. The absurdity of the situation cracked something open inside Felix. Suddenly he was laughing harder, real laughter, messy and uncontrollable, the kind he hadn't felt in weeks. Hyunjin stared at him in surprise before smiling unconsciously too. And even Lee Know's expression softened while watching him laugh, because maybe this was what they had all been missing lately. Not perfection, not forced happiness, just honesty, messy, painful honesty. And somehow that felt more real than pretending everything was fine.
For the first time in months, the dorm felt warm again, not completely healed, not perfect, but alive. Laughter drifted softly from the living room while midnight snacks filled the kitchen counters with instant noodles, soda cans and crumbs from half-finished chips. The television played quietly in the background, though nobody was really watching it. Felix sat cross-legged on the couch between Hyunjin and Han while the others argued loudly about movies. It felt normal, dangerously normal. Because part of Felix kept waiting for the warmth to disappear again. Trauma did that to people, it taught them happiness was temporary. You're spacing out. Felix blinked, turning toward Hyunjin. You've been staring at the same chip for like 2 minutes. Snorted beside him. Maybe he's emotionally bonding with it. Threw the chip at him immediately, Han gasped dramatically. Violence. Others laughed, even Felix smiled. But from across the room, Lee Know was watching him quietly again. Not coldly this time, carefully, as if relearning him. Felix noticed immediately. And for some reason that attention made his chest feel tight. Later that night the dorm slowly emptied as exhaustion dragged everyone toward sleep. One by one lights switched off and doors closed softly down the hallway. Eventually only Felix remained awake. Again. The city outside glittered through the living room windows, distant headlights moving like rivers beneath the dark sky. The dorm felt different at night. Quieter, lonelier, filled with thoughts too loud to ignore. Felix sat curled beneath a blanket on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through old photos on his phone. Australia, family, beaches, childhood friends, then newer photos, concerts, members, late-night practices, birthday cakes. Hyunjin asleep on his shoulder during flights. Chan laughing during rehearsals. Lee Know holding his hoodie sleeve absent-mindedly in the background of one blurry picture. Felix stared at that photo longer than the others. A soft click interrupted his thoughts. The kitchen light turned on. Lee Know walked inside quietly, clearly surprised to find Felix still awake. You're doing it again, smiled faintly. What? Thinking too loudly. That's not a real thing. It is with you. Lee Know opened the refrigerator before pulling out 2 bottled waters automatically, one for himself, one for Felix, like habit, like muscle memory. Felix accepted it softly. Thanks. Lee Know leaned against the kitchen counter, studying him for a moment. You haven't slept properly in weeks, have you? Felix looked away. That answer alone was enough. Lee Know sighed quietly. When did it start? Felix twisted the bottle cap nervously. I don't know. That's a lie. Swallowed hard, because he did know. It started after the Australia offer, after the guilt, after convincing himself he was selfish for wanting two different homes at the same time. I thought something was wrong with me, Felix admitted quietly. Lee Know frowned slightly. For missing home, for not knowing what I wanted anymore. The living room fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic outside. Lee Know walked closer slowly before sitting on the opposite end of the couch, not forcing closeness, just offering presence. You know what I think? He asked softly. Felix shook his head. I think you've been trying so hard to make everyone comfortable that you forgot you're allowed to be confused too. Felix's throat tightened painfully, because nobody had ever said it like that before. Idols weren't supposed to hesitate, not publicly, not emotionally. People wanted certainty. Smiles, gratitude, not fear, not exhaustion, not homesickness so intense it felt physical. Felix stared down at his hands. Sometimes I feel guilty for being tired. Lee Know's expression changed immediately. Sharp sadness crossed his face. You really think you have to earn the right to rest? Felix didn't answer. That silence hurt more than words. Lee Know rubbed his face tiredly before laughing bitterly under his breath. You know, for someone who acts sunshine like all the time, your inner thoughts are deeply concerning. A tiny laugh escaped Felix, then silence returned again, gentler now. The city lights reflected softly across the room while exhaustion slowly settled into both of them. Finally, Felix spoke quietly. Why did you pull away instead of talking to me? Lee Know stared at the ceiling for several seconds before answering. Because I knew if I asked you directly, his voice lowered slightly. And you told me you wanted to leave, I wouldn't know how to survive hearing it. His heart ached instantly. Lee Know rarely sounded vulnerable, but tonight every truth felt stripped bare between them. I never wanted to hurt you, Felix whispered. I know. No, I really didn't. Lee Know finally looked at him directly. His eyes looked exhausted, soft, human. I hurt myself, he admitted quietly. I kept imagining worst-case scenarios until I started believing them. Felt tears gathering again. This time he didn't hide them, and Lee Know didn't look away from them either. For months they had been speaking around each other instead of to each other, protecting themselves, misunderstanding each other, bleeding quietly while pretending everything was manageable. But now the truth sat openly between them, messy, painful, real. Felix wiped his eyes with embarrassment. I'm tired of feeling scared all the time. Lee Know's expression softened completely at that, then quietly, carefully, he reached over and pulled the blanket higher around Felix's shoulders, such a small gesture but impossibly gentle. You don't have to carry everything alone anymore, Lee Know murmured. The words nearly broke Felix apart completely, because deep down that was all he wanted. Not perfection, not endless praise, just someone willing to stay even after seeing the ugly parts, the exhausted parts, the confused parts, and Lee Know had stayed through all of them.